You don't become terrible by accident. The name isn't a myth. It's a verdict. Imagine a man who prayed harder than anyone in the empire. A man who fasted for days, trembling before icons, prostrating himself in cathedrals heavy with incense and silence. A man who believed, no, knew, that he had been chosen by God himself to purify the land, to root out evil, to bring order through terror. And then imagine that same man, moments later ordering the eyes gouged out of a boyar's son, or watching flames consume an entire village because a woman once laughed too freely in his court, and then, calmly, returning to prayer, hands still stained, tears of divine ecstasy on his face. This is not the story of a madman. It's the story of a man who believed he was right. Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan the Terrible, didn't rule. He judged. He saw himself as a living sword in the hand of God, and he believed Russia was a festering wound of betrayal and sin that needed to be cleansed with fire. He wasn't born into brutality. He grew into it like armor. The orphan boy who watched nobles starve his mother, who lived surrounded by poison and whispers, who learned young that love was just a weakness someone could twist. The boy became the Tsar, but the boy never left. Power came early, and with it came paranoia. But not the petty kind, the kind that blossoms in isolation and silence in the cold vaults of palaces where no laughter is allowed. Ivan surrounded himself with death because death was the only thing that couldn't betray him. His court became a theater of blood, his state a religion of cruelty, and yet to the common people, he was divine. He walked among them barefoot, he wept for their suffering, he punished nobles who abused peasants, and they adored him for it. It's this contradiction that shaped his rule, and broke his soul. Ivan didn't fear rebellion. He feared intimacy. He feared that love might soften him, that compassion might crack the iron mask he'd forged over decades. And nowhere was this tension more violent, more unbearable than in his relationship with his son. Ivan Ivanovich, the heir. He was everything his father wanted. Strong, loyal, pious. And yet, Ivan the Terrible didn't trust him, because he didn't trust anyone. They say the incident began over a dress. A woman's dress. Too revealing, too immodest. Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law. She collapsed. The child inside her died. His son, furious, confronted him. A shout, a slap, a staff. Heavy, sharp-edged. The blow wasn't meant to kill, but it did. And in that moment, something broke that even Ivan couldn't fix. There are paintings of that moment. Father cradling son, blood on his robes, horror in his eyes. But paintings lie. They turn madness into tragedy. What they can't show is what came next. Because Ivan didn't cry for his son. Not at first. He prayed. He howled. He locked himself in a cathedral for days. And then he said it. That God had willed it. That it was justice. That the boy had been corrupted by pride, seduced by foreign heresies. That the blow wasn't an accident. It was a test. And he passed. Because a Tsar doesn't love. A Tsar doesn't grieve. A Tsar obeys. And this, more than the murder, is the true horror. What do you become when you convince yourself that every sin is sacred? When every act of violence is baptized in divine light? When even the blood of your own child becomes proof that you are chosen? You become something holy. You become something monstrous. You become Ivan the Terrible. They called him Tsar, but in his mind, Ivan was already something more. A prophet, a scourge, a mirror of divine wrath cast in flesh and crowned by fire. The church trembled before him, and the boyars feared his shadow more than exile. He wore robes of velvet, but beneath them were scars, old ones from childhood beatings and new ones, self-inflicted in punishment or prayer. No man ever ruled Russia like this before. No man ever dared. And still, he could not escape the ghosts. Every corridor of the Kremlin echoed with betrayal. Every whisper behind a curtain became a plot. There were no friends in the palace, only watchers and informants, each one as replaceable as a candle burned too low. Ivan began to speak of devils hiding in men's skin, of serpents who drank from the same chalices, slept beneath the same roofs. He would scream their names, scrawl them on walls, demand their blood as proof of his loyalty to heaven. In his eyes, murder was devotion. Mercy was treason. That's when the Oprichniki came. Black-robed, black-horsed, black-hearted. They were his angels of death. Not soldiers, not guards, but priests of fear. They rode through the streets like shadows, dragging men from homes, parading heads on spikes, sending entire cities into silence. Ivan had created his own inquisition, But unlike the West, it had no rules, no pretense of a law, only obedience to a single wrathful will. And always, behind them, the Tsar's voice. God demands purity. They carved that purity into the bones of Russia. Entire noble families vanished. Monasteries were looted. Their holy relics shattered or defiled. Women were taken, tortured, discarded. Fields burned, churches desecrated. In Novgorod, a city accused of imagined treason, the Oprichniki murdered by the thousands, drowning the innocent in frozen rivers, watching as ice turned red and cracked beneath the weight of bodies. Ivan himself stood by the banks, weeping and praying as the executions continued, and to those who begged for mercy, he only whispered, "You do not understand. This is salvation." But power that feeds on fear always turns inward. The boyars, broken as they were, began to vanish too quickly. Paranoia metastasized. Ivan saw enemies in portraits, heard them in dreams. His court grew smaller, colder. He began to speak to the dead, to summon the ghosts of saints, to ask them for guidance and forgiveness, or permission. At night he would wander the halls barefoot, muttering to statues, whipping himself raw until the walls gleamed with blood. And through it all his son watched. Ivan Ivanovich, the Golden One, the pride of Russia, raised to inherit both throne and madness. He learned to smile like his father, to wield cruelty with grace, but he also learned something Ivan could never forgive: restraint. Where Ivan destroyed, his son sought diplomacy. Where Ivan saw heresy, his son saw complexity. And most dangerously, where Ivan built silence, his son tried to speak. That was the deepest wound. Not rebellion, not betrayal, difference. In Ivan's mind, his son was slipping, tainted by foreign tutors, softened by the West, seduced by the thought that rule could be something other than divine vengeance. And yet, even with suspicion churning beneath his skin, Ivan clung to him. Because in the boy's eyes, Ivan still saw the only thing he had ever loved, or at least the echo of it. But love to a man like Ivan was unbearable. It was a risk, a door that led to softness, to guilt, and guilt was the one thing the Tsar could not survive. And so, on that final day, when words turned to shouting and fear cracked into rage, the line between father and ruler disappeared. The hand that had held a cross now held a staff. And with a single blow, the heir of Russia crumpled to the floor, eyes wide, mouth silent. Ivan's scream didn't come immediately. First there was stillness, horror. Then came the collapse, the wailing, the trembling, the prayer. He called for physicians, for priests, for God. But none answered. His son died in silence. And Ivan for the first time realized that even divine wrath could not resurrect what it had broken. The room where his son died became a tomb long before they buried the body. No incense could mask the air of guilt. No icon could absorb the weight of that final silence. The blood had been wiped away. The priests had chanted their rituals. And yet the walls still held the scream. Not the son's, but the father's. A scream not of sorrow, but of recognition. Because in that moment, Ivan did not just kill his child. He killed the last witness to his humanity. The court grew quieter in the days that followed. Ministers avoided eye contact. The surviving boyars bowed deeper, walked softer. But no one dared speak the name. Ivan himself avoided it too. He called his son the Holy One, the pure heir, the one stolen by devils. He wept in public, ripped his garments, kissed icons with bleeding lips. But behind the tears there was no repentance, only performance. The Tsar who had ruled by terror was now worshipping his own guilt like a relic. But even guilt, when left unchecked, mutates. He began writing letters again, thousands of them, to monasteries, to foreign kings, to invisible enemies. In them he confessed and accused in the same breath. "I am dust," he wrote in one, "and yet I am the rod of the Lord." He spoke of demons in the palace, of witches among the servants, of boyars trying to poison his soul with grief. He asked for penance, but demanded execution. He asked for mercy, then decreed death. There was no logic, only hunger, a hunger to make the world match the storm inside him. And so the killings resumed. But they were different now. Not political, not strategic. They were ritual. He would select a man at random from the ranks, accuse him of a dream, of a glance, of a forgotten word. The accused would be brought before him, stripped, beaten, sometimes tortured in the throne room itself. And then Ivan would ask, "Do you love me?" If the answer was yes, he would nod. If the answer was no, he would nod. And always in the end he would whisper, "You remind me of him." Then the sword would fall. He turned his sorrow into spectacle, his penitence into performance. In church he crawled on the ground in rags, moaning like a beast. Outside, he ordered churches to be built in the name of his son, each one more lavish, more brutalist, more insane. In one, he demanded the bells toll only once a year, on the anniversary of the murder, and only with the voice of iron forged from confiscated weapons. In another, he ordered frescoes of saints to be repainted with bleeding eyes. But no architecture could contain the infection. The people, once terrified, now began to whisper. Was he cursed? Was he damned? The peasants believed the devil had entered his veins. Merchants crossed themselves when they saw his retinue pass. Mothers taught their sons to never raise their voices. And through it all, Ivan watched with growing obsession. He recorded the reactions, catalogued the fear. He believed the pain he had caused was sacred, that Russia needed a father who could kill his own son and still be worshipped. Because in his mind, that was power. Not love, not order, but awe. The kind of awe that erases memory, that melts guilt into reverence. He began to speak of himself in divine metaphors again. The hammer and the flame, the lion and the angel. He was no longer a man. He was what God became when he got tired of forgiveness. And yet, there were nights when the pretense cracked, when the candlelight revealed not a prophet, but a trembling old man pacing the floor in silence, when the shadow he saw on the wall wasn't an enemy, but his son, when he would drop to his knees, clutching the floor as if it could take him too, whispering his name over and over in a voice softer than any he had ever used in life. My son, my boy, my Ivan. But the silence always won. By morning the mask was back on, the eyes hardened, the hands steady. The sermons resumed, and those who dared to remember the scream, they disappeared. He began to believe that God had chosen him not just to rule, but to suffer, that his pain was holy, that the blood he spilled was a kind of sacrament. Each execution a twisted communion with the divine. His palace became a church, his throne a pulpit, his punishments a liturgy. And in this grotesque theology, the murder of his son was not a sin, but a sacrifice, not a mistake, but a prophecy fulfilled. Because if God had allowed it, how could it have been wrong? He spoke this aloud one evening to no one and to everyone. The candlelight flickered across his face as he said it. God wanted me to prove I would choose him over my own blood. The courtiers froze. No one dared ask what he had said in return. And so the silence stretched. He turned even his memories into prisons. The boy's childhood, his voice, his laughter, the promise in his eyes, all reinterpreted through the lens of divine test. He was too proud, Ivan muttered. He would have betrayed me. God saw it. I saw it. I stopped it. But even the most elaborate lies began to crack at the edges. Because late at night, when the torches dimmed and the palace corridors echoed with wind, the Tsar heard things no one else heard. The footsteps of someone who no longer lived. The soft knock on a door that would never open again. The voice, tender, accusatory, and still so young, asking, "Was I your enemy, father, or your mirror?" Ivar began to sleep less. He paced his rooms for hours, fingering old relics and broken toys, whispering names like spells. Some days, he refused to speak at all, sitting for hours in silence with his head bowed, as if listening to something below the floorboards. And then suddenly he would rise, and command another death, because only more death could drown the memory. He ordered the boyars to kneel before a throne draped in black, a throne he claimed belonged to his son in the afterlife. He made them swear loyalty not just to the living Tsar, but to the ghost. Some wept, some resisted, all eventually broke. He made poets write verses about divine madness, about how a king's love must be so fierce it devours, about how mercy is the language of cowards, about how fathers must sometimes become executioners for the good of the soul. He carved these words into stone. He believed them, but even that wasn't enough. He began to construct an afterlife in his mind, a mythic Russia that would outlive his own guilt, a Russia where his crimes would be seen as visionary, where the bloodshed would become folklore, and where no one would remember the boy's name. He feared that history would turn on him, that the world would remember the son, not the father. So he erased the son, slowly, methodically. Portraits were taken down, records were corrected, stories were silenced, and in their place Ivan planted myths, that the boy had plotted treason, that he had consorted with enemies, that he had tried to overthrow his father in a moment of rebellion. The truth was rewritten not with ink, but with terror, and everyone knew the price of remembering it differently. But truth doesn't die. It waits, And in the silence between Ivan's proclamations, in the gaps between sermons and screams, it gathered like fog. The people knew. The court knew. Even the priests forced to sanctify the act knew. The empire moved forward, but a shadow followed them. A shadow shaped like a crown. A cradle. A pool of blood on the palace floor. Ivory began to wither, not in power, and that remained absolute, but in soul. His body twisted from age and paranoia. His eyes sunk deeper, more glass than flesh. His laughter grew louder, but more brittle. He saw betrayal in every reflection. He trusted no one, not even the church, not even God. He once locked himself in a chapel for 3 days, refusing food or water. When he emerged, his beard was soaked in tears. "I saw him," he whispered, "my son, and he forgave me." But no one knew if that was grace or delusion. He spoke more often to the dead than the living. He claimed visions, conversations with angels, debates with demons. He would interrupt meetings to ask if anyone else could hear the bells tolling, even when no bells rang. He once halted an execution mid-sentence, staring upward as if listening to a verdict from heaven. The man who once controlled Russia with an iron will now stumble through his own kingdom of ghosts. But power, like madness, is infectious. The court adapted. They learned to nod at his hallucinations, to weep when he wept, to laugh when he laughed, even when it made no sense. Reality became a performance curated around his delusions. No one corrected him. No one dared. And so the truth stayed buried, beneath ritual, beneath cruelty, beneath fear. But it never disappeared. It lingered. In the gaze of a servant, in the silence of a hallway, in the cracks on a portrait's varnish. Because some deaths don't end with the body. Some haunt everything they leave behind. The older he became, the more Ivan wrapped himself in the language of prophecy. He spoke of signs in the sky, of comets and eclipses as divine messengers. He ordered scribes to record his visions as scripture, claiming they would one day form the true gospel of Russia, a gospel written in blood, madness, and sovereign grace. He was not a man anymore, not even a ruler. He had become a myth that still breathed, still punished, still begged forgiveness, and denied it to all. Inside his chambers, relics of grief began to pile. The small boot of his son, once forgotten under a cot, now placed atop a golden pedestal. A shard of mirror from the night of the killing, its edge still rust-colored. A wax figure sculpted to look like the boy, dressed in royal garb, lips closed as if afraid to speak. Every object became sacred. Every crack in the wall a possible message from God or ghost. He began to build his own tomb while still alive. Not in stone, but in silence. He stopped trusting even his closest circle. Men who had knelt beside him for decades were suddenly accused of conspiracy. Their eyes were too calm, their hands too clean, their prayers too short. He tortured one for smiling in a dream. He once whispered to his advisor, "I am not afraid of betrayal. I am afraid of being forgiven." Forgiveness would mean facing it, naming it, remembering the shape of his son's face, the echo of the blow, the moment the world split open. Better to be damned by heaven than pitied by it. Damnation gave him purpose. Redemption would only leave him empty. So he cursed the boy aloud. He blamed the mother. He accused foreign plots. And then, weeping, he claimed once again that God told him to do it. His theology twisted into something darker than heresy. He believed that true rulers were not measured by mercy but by the weight of their sins, that a czar must carry a cross so heavy no one else would dare touch it, and that by killing his own blood he had reached a realm no ordinary man could understand. He did not want to be loved. He wanted to be feared the way one fears the apocalypse. But the empire was not blind. People talked. In hushed tones, behind locked doors, they spoke of the day Ivan struck his son, how the boy had fallen with no sound but the soft thud of flesh on tile, how the Tsar had collapsed moments later, cradling the body, screaming a name he never uttered again, and how no priest dared say the burial rite aloud. In the villages, stories began to form, not rebellion, no one dared, but myth. They whispered that the ghost of the prince wandered the forest, faceless, seeking justice, that anyone who heard the wind cry at night had heard his name, that Ivan had cursed the land with a death too large for the ground to contain. And in the Kremlin, the air grew thick with waiting. Waiting for what? For the Tsar to break, or for God to finally answer. He no longer ruled so much as he haunted. His decrees were erratic, his face as pale as wax. He held court in silence, making nobles sweat under his stare. He ordered executions, then reversed them, then reordered them again. He built a wooden model of the kingdom and wept over it like a child over broken toys. Sometimes he kissed the feet of beggars. Sometimes he spit on bishops. He claimed to see angels crawling from the bell towers, their wings soaked in ink. He asked the palace servants if they could smell fire, if they could hear trumpets, if the floor felt like it was trembling. They all said yes, because to say no meant death. And so the performance continued, a nation dancing around a man unraveling. Nobles bowed to ghosts, guards saluted shadows, and a son's absence was treated like a national holiday, sacred, unspeakable, and soaked in dread. He once carved into a table, "I am not the monster they say I am. I am the punishment for theirs." And no one knew if he meant his enemies, or himself. He began to sleep in armor, as if war was always moments away. He refused food unless it was tasted by 3 men first. He covered mirrors with cloth. He banned music on certain days. He named the days arbitrarily, depending on the silence of birds or the weight of his chest. He told a courtier, "If God made me Tsar, then every horror I perform is holy, even when I hate it, especially when I hate it." But the hatred never stayed contained. He hated himself, and that hatred bled into everyone else. He pushed away advisors, family, even the church. He called the patriarch a coward. He declared himself priest, prophet, and executioner. His word was divine law, not because it was right, but because no one was allowed to survive calling it wrong. And yet, despite it all, the madness, the paranoia, the violence, he wept, not publicly, not often, but behind locked doors, where he would kneel before an empty crib, not his son's, but one carved by his own hand, and beg for forgiveness in whispers so quiet they made the walls ache. No answer ever came, only silence, and the sound of a man dying not in body, but in the unbearable echo of what he had done. It is said that near the end of his life, Ivan the Terrible became obsessed with death, not the spectacle of it. He had long grown numb to screams and blood, but the intimacy of it. He wanted to know how it felt to vanish, to be judged, to stand before the god he had invoked so many times as justification and shield. He spoke often of dreams. In them he walked alone through an empty Kremlin, its corridors rotting, its bells silent. The portraits bled from the walls, and all the thrones were broken. In the center of the great hall stood a single figure, his son crowned but eyeless. Ivan would approach him, reach out, and then wake with a gasp before his fingers made contact. He believed this dream was a warning or a prophecy, or both. The man who once ruled through terror now trembled at shadows of his own making. His health began to fail. His body, once thick with violent energy, shrank. He had stomach spasms that left him writhing. His joints cracked like old wood. His eyes sank into his skull, and his voice grew hoarse, as though each word had to claw its way out from under layers of ash. He doubled down on ritual. He made priests anoint his chamber daily with holy oil. He ordered icons arranged in precise geometries, believing their alignment could ward off the devil. He confessed sins to monks, only to recant the confessions the next day and accuse them of heresy for hearing them. He feared that the devil no longer wanted his soul, because he already owned it. And perhaps more terrifyingly, that God had stopped watching altogether. But the world outside Ivan's cracked consciousness moved on, slowly and with scars, but it moved. A generation that's grown under his rule that knew only pain, only obedience. Russia had become an empire of silence, not peace, a land where even thoughts had to bow. And yet, as he weakened, the silence shifted. People no longer wept when his name was spoken. They whispered it like the name of a plague that had passed, not a man, but a fever. But Ivan wasn't done. Even as his body failed, his will clawed through the dark. He plotted new alliances. He accused new enemies. He attempted to remarry, to secure a final heir, as if replacing the irreplaceable could cleanse him. But every woman he approached declined or mysteriously died. In truth, no queen could sit beside him. His throne was soaked in blood, and everyone could see it now. Then, on a cold day in March, Ivan collapsed while playing chess. His last game, fittingly, ended not with a checkmate, but with his fingers still clutching a pawn, as if unsure whether he was king or servant, monster or martyr. He died the way he lived, grasping for control mid-move, half aware. The empire did not erupt in mourning. There were no cries of loss, only sighs of something like relief. The walls of the Kremlin did not fall, but it felt as if they exhaled. And still, no one dared speak of the son. Not openly, but the image lingered in the collective mind of Russia. Of the Tsar, kneeling in red, eyes wild, holding a dying boy in his arms and whispering to God like a mad prophet lost in a temple built of guilt. Artists tried to paint it. One did, Ilya Repin, centuries later. And in that canvas, Ivan's scream is silent but eternal. His hands tremble, his eyes are wide with disbelief, as if only in that moment did he realize what he had done. And the prince, cradled in death, looks not afraid but betrayed. That is the legacy Ivan left behind. Not power, not empire, but a wound in the soul of a nation, a warning written in the language of grief. And history, in its cruel efficiency, recorded his title as the Terrible. Not because of what he suffered, but because of what he became. He was not born evil. He was made, forged in traumas, crowned in fire, devoured by fear, and driven by the belief that divinity could be seized through blood and agony. He wanted to be a god. He died as a man broken by his own myth. And somewhere in the silence after his death, in the corridors once filled with screams, perhaps the faintest echo of a boy's voice could still be heard, not cursing, not pleading, just asking, why? And if you listen closely, centuries later, no answer ever comes. Only the sound of footsteps, walking away from a throne no one truly wanted, toward a history too heavy to forget, too human to forgive, and too sacred in its horror to repeat.